Today is Sunday, December 10th, year 2000, and we're in the home of Leonard Alberts at 25 Maynard Road in Northampton. And the interviewer is Ken Schoen, and we will be discussing prayer, services, the history of the synagogue, and such matters.
So Leonard, I'd like to find out some things about how the synagogue community has evolved since the time your family joined and started the shul. So let's first find out, when did you and your family start in Northampton in terms of the Jewish community?
My mother's family, members of my mother's family arrived here first, I think in the 1890s. Settled in Leeds, and gradually other members of the family arrived. I suppose they were peddlers originally, and after some years, two of my mother's brothers opened a clothing store on Main Street, approximately where Raymond Insurance is, that general area.
Was there a Jewish community existing in the 1890s in Northampton?
The first Jewish arrivals in Northampton were German Jews, and there was a nucleus of German Jews here from around Civil War time onward. I know of no formal organization of a worship group until maybe the late 1890s, early 1900s. And by that time there was a nucleus of Eastern European Jews in the community. Ashkenazic Jews from Russia and Lithuania.
And did that group start a worship service?
Yes, they met in rented quarters somewhere, a room here or there someplace, and they did have services of a type.
And so what happened when your family came? Did they join this group or did they form their own group?
No, they were part of the existing Eastern European group. My father had relatives in Boston. How he met my mother, I don't know. They were probably introduced by someone or other, because he would pedal with a pack on his back, and by that time my mother's family was pretty much settled in this area. And they were actually married here in Florence. There was a building there called Cosmian Hall that's since been destroyed, taken down. They were married there around 1897-98.
Where'd the rabbi come from who married them? Do you know?
I have no idea. My earliest recollections, and that goes back to when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, there was a cantor sheikhet here in Northampton named Mallon. Actually, he was a relative of this woman retired from the theater department at Smith College, who was a member of the congregation. I can't recall her name at the moment.
And where was this? So the first shul was located where? This Eastern European group rented a hall?
They rented some rooms, I gather. I don't know just where or how.
Was there a division between the German Jews and the Eastern European Jews?
Yes, I think there was to some extent. A little bit of looking down your nose at the others.
The newcomers.
Yeah, and vice versa. But in any case, when it came time to form a formal synagogue, the community united in its support and in its membership. The St. John's Episcopal Church is now located in the big stone church on Elm Street. Originally had their location on Bridge Street, approximately where L&H Television is now, approximately across from the post office. The church had moved out of that building and it had been vacant for some time. The Jewish community expressed an interest in buying it, and the church looked kindly upon the idea that it would continue as a religious edifice, offered it for a very, very modest price. And they managed to arrive at a deal and did some alterations, and that became our synagogue at around 1905.
The community was an Orthodox community.
Oh yes, Orthodox community. No mixed seating. The women sat in the balcony. The men sat on the main floor.
Was there a lay rabbi, or you brought in a rabbi? Do you know?
Off and on, there were rabbis brought in, but this Malin, the Cantor Shochet, he pretty much fulfilled all the needs of the community.
Was there a mikveh, or did people go to Springfield?
Not to my knowledge.
How many members do you think there were in the early 1900s in this community?
I would guess, I really don't know at this point. I would guess maybe 30, 40.
Would they basically just meet on Shabbos, or would they have a minyan? What's your thought? How much of a community, how close a community do you feel from your parents this group was? What's your sense of it? Were they merchants who got together and they talked about business? Were they Jews who studied together? What was their bind that kept them?
A large percentage were peddlers, junk dealers. They'd have a horse and a wagon, they'd make the rounds of the community, shouting to pick up papers, junk, whatever anyone had. The early days of recycling.
Want to hold it up? It's the dedication book, 1963, from Congregation B'nai Israel.
Now, you asked about the Jewish group incorporated themselves, received a charter under the name of Congregation B'nai Israel. The charter members were Elias Alberts, that was my father, Bennett August, Abram Barger, Samuel Carlson, Frank Cohn, Harris Cohn, Herman Cohn, Marcus Cohn, Simon Cohn, father of Marcus, another Simon Cohn, Albert Alinsky, Jacob Alinsky, Samuel Alinsky, Isaac Michelman, Jacob Michelman, Max Michelman, Meyer Michelman, Max Shaven, A.W. Stone, and Hyman Ziff. The building was dedicated on August 22nd, 1905.
Oh, we're talking about which building?
This is the building that was on
Here's a picture of it.
St. John's Episcopal Church.
That was. It's where,
Hold it up.
approximately where L&H television is now.
What are your earliest memories in terms of the shul itself and the membership and the community? How far back can you go?
I can go back to about the time I was 5 years old and went to the synagogue with my father or my mother. And at a very early age, 7, 8 years old, I was then permitted to walk to the synagogue by myself. We lived on Fruit Street, and not too much of a walk to the synagogue, and I was permitted to go by myself. And I would sit with my father in a pew together. My mother, when she would go, would sit upstairs in the gallery.
How about a Hebrew school? How did you get your religious instruction when you were 6, 7, 8, 9 years old?
We had a Talmud Torah. In those years, we must have had a rabbi, because I remember there was a one-class school, and we had a rabbi who taught the class.
Just boys?
Just boys in the class.
Just boys in the class, yeah.
What kind of religious instruction do you think the women got?
In addition to the cheder, we had Sunday school where both boys and girls went, taught by lay people in the community. That was about all the girls got, unless they had private instruction in the home. I remember my folks had a tutor come to instruct my 2 sisters.
What year are we talking about now?
We're talking now about the 1920s.
So I would imagine at that point there may have been 50 Jewish families? How
And
many
I think
would
a
you
little
say?
more at that point, probably up around 80.
What do you think attracted more and more Jewish families to Northampton?
I don't know. Just in those years there was quite an influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe, and they would drift in wherever they had relatives or friends, or someone who would help them get a start. The August family was very large, very large. One of the names I read was Bennett August. There were several brothers. There was a N.H. August, grandfather of Bob, mother of Mildred Wolfe. There was a Morris August, who was the father of all those August children that ran the August store eventually. And Bennett August, who had a fairly large family of boys and girls. I think there may have been another or two others who didn't live in Northampton.
One of the August family were cattle dealers, is that right?
Yes, that was N.H. August, the grandfather of Bob.
Tell me about the junk dealers in town.
There were several junk dealers in town. It seemed to be a Jewish occupation. I don't know, there must have been 7 or 8.
And how did they gather up the junk? What was their method?
They had horse and wagon. And they would traverse the streets shouting out paper, junk, and people who had accumulated newspapers or had some junk they wanted to dispose of would call them in, and they'd make a deal. They'd drag the stuff out to their wagon and take it to their barn or wherever. And every once in a while, one of these bigger dealers from Springfield or Holyoke would come and pick the stuff up, bring it in for recycling.
Do you imagine that each of these 7 junk dealers had a territory in town, or they competed with each other?
No, I think they just competed. I don't think they had territories that they assigned to each other. The major junk dealer in Northampton was the partnership of Carlson and Barger. They were major dealers. They dealt mostly in metals. They had a big yard up where the Northampton Honda garage is now.
Is that Bodger, you said? Or
Pardon?
Carlson and?
Barger. That was one of the names of the founders that I read off before.
What became of them and their families?
They either moved away or died off. The girls married usually out of the community, and the boys would find employment elsewhere.
I'd like to get back now to the synagogue community.
Right.
Can you give us some sense of how the Jewish community evolved? It started out as an Orthodox community.
Right.
At what point did it find itself needing to transform itself?
Well, after World War II, there was a general meeting of the congregation, kind of a soul-searching, which direction we wanted to go. Do we want to stay Orthodox or conservative or Reform? And the sense of the community was that we wanted to affiliate with a conservative movement, which we did.
Why do you think that was? What was going on within
Well,
the community?
I think that for one thing, there was a physical problem. The balcony in the synagogue became unsafe, so we couldn't segregate the women to the balcony.
There were so many women now who were coming to shul.
Yes, on the high holidays, not many on the Sabbath. So first they put a mechitza on the main floor, and women would sit behind that, but that only was there for a couple of years, and women started to drift down to sit with their husband, and nothing was made of it, and the mixed seating just gradually moved into the format of the service.
The year?
What year was that about, where the women drifted down and joined their husbands?
I would say in the late 1940s.
So it already was in play for the congregation to say, we want to become now conservative.
Right, right.
How did the World War affect all this? You had a lot of young Jewish men leaving town to fight in the war. Was there...
Oh, yes, yes. There were many in the service, great many.
How did that affect services during the war? Do you know? Did they still have...
Well, I don't think it had much of an effect on the services, but not very many of those younger men would attend services in any case.
And after the war, was there, let's say in the early 50s, was there an influx of refugees and survivors to the community?
There wasn't an influx. There were a few.
How did they happen to come here?
I don't know whether an agency led them here or if some had relatives here or what, but there were just a few. There weren't many that came into the community.
Do you know who they were? Their names?
There was a man named Herman who was a photographer, had a place on Main Street. There was one man, I think his name was Kahn, who was offered a professorship at Smith, but he wasn't active in the community or the synagogue. Some came into the community because of opportunities at UMass, teaching opportunities. But there wasn't a large influx.
Let's go back now. So, in the early 50s, it sounds like the synagogue now affiliated itself with the conservative movement.
Yeah.
Were there some people within the community who said, we want to stay Orthodox. We don't want to. We can't do this.
Well, the change in the format of the liturgy of the religious services was not much. It continued just as it was, and no women had Elias, no women led the service. So there wasn't really any real change in the synagogue programming itself. The big change was when we hired a conservative rabbi, Asher Bar Zev, who was then known as Asher Langenauer.
And that was when? About
1963, because he came in just as we moved into the new building.
When the community hired him, did you have a sense that he would bring about substantial changes in the liturgy or in the way the service was done?
I don't think we did have that sense, but he had his own program, and we all went along with it.
Was there discussion? Was there a group that said, we're not ready for this, we want to stay with the way we're doing?
No,
we want
I
to use a
don't.
prayer book that we've been using, let's say.
I don't think so, because there was no change in our prayer book. We continued to use the Silverman. The format of the service wasn't changed radically. Some parts were omitted. That was the biggest change. Gradually, when Rabbi Langenauer was here, big changes started to take place. That's when women started to be counted to the minyan, where women could lead service, where women could have an aliyah. So by the time he left, we were pretty much in the format that we're in now, but not quite as I don't want to say liberal. I mean to say not quite as far as the omissions of so much of the service as there is now.
Was this voted in by a ritual committee?
How did this all take place? Did the ritual committee meet and with the rabbi and say, let's talk about changes that are taking place or going to take place?
The ritual committee used to meet fairly frequently with the rabbi, and we would discuss various things. But there was really no opposition in the ritual committee to whatever program the rabbi wanted to institute.
Why do you think that was? I'm sure some of them had strong beliefs or feelings that it should go a certain way, and now someone was coming in and saying we're doing it differently.
No, I don't think that was the case. I think by that time, so many of the real traditional observers had passed on, and those who were left were willing to accept whatever our new rabbi wanted. There wasn't any strong opposition whatsoever.
Was there ever a time when you had daily minions? In the morning or in the afternoon where you had a group?
I think so, but it was really before my time. Frequently, it was made up in great part of the junk dealers who would come to a morning minyan before starting on their rounds. However, there was always a morning minyan for anyone who had a yortzeit and wanted it. When my father Shomsad died, that was followed very soon after that by the widow of Bennett August. Now, between his sons and my brother and myself and a few others, we had a morning minyan for about 6 months, and then that kind of faded out.
What?
But we did continue with a Mincha Meira service for the full year.
What year was that about? How long ago?
1932 or 3.
What are your thoughts about the shul today in terms of having all these different communities in the same synagogue, and the New Age and the Renewal and the Orthodox and the Meditation Minyan? From your years and years of life in this community, what's your sense of it? What's your feelings about it?
I don't know how much it's accomplishing or what it does and what need it fulfills. I really don't know. I think our regular service has strayed pretty far from traditionalism. And I'm not very happy about that personally. These other services, Rabbi Flam's service, the Eisen service, kind of leaves me cold. I have no interest in it, but I'm just talking for myself at this point. The Orthodox service I find to be very interesting, but most of the time they don't even have a minyan. But there's some strength to see even that nucleus of orthodoxy in the communities is in and of itself very interesting.
Technically speaking, can you recall some of the things that were omitted from the service that you felt are important to include in the service that over time have been left out?
Well, concentrating only on the Sabbath service. We used to say the complete service from Mizmor right on through to the Yom. Asher Bar Zev started to omit some portions of the early morning readings and so forth, and Rabbi Grobart has omitted even more. There are portions after before Musaf that we always used to include like your Kumper Korn and Al Harachamim that are now omitted. The Yom is omitted, and I'm not too happy about that. Those are nice parts of the service. I hate to see it ignored.
Did they used to repeat the Amida at the Musaf service?
Yes, they used to repeat both Amidas. Then they started to repeat only Shacharit. Now they don't repeat either one.
How about the Torah? Did they do the complete Torah portion?
Yes, they did the complete Torah portion. It was Rabbi Langenauer instituted the triennial reading cycle.
When was that?
Well, he came in 1963.
You mean up to that point, every Shabbos they read the whole Torah portion?
Right.
Who would do that? Who was so knowledgeable that could do that?
Well, when we had a rabbi, he would do it.
And when you didn't?
There were lay people who could do it.
What happened to that instruction? They learned it. How come it wasn't passed down to the next generation, this ability to do it?
These people learned it in Europe before they came here.
Tell me about the Hebrew school. That brings me to that. Do you have any opinions about the nature of how the religion and the Hebrew was taught, and what could be done, what wasn't done?
Well, the Hebrew school concentrated on learning to read Hebrew so you could participate in the liturgy. There was some attempt to do a little translation of the Chumash, but it was very limited. Most of it was just drill on learning the prayers.
This was your experience too?
Yeah, yes.
How would you do it now? If you were the Hebrew school teacher, what would be your suggestion? How to instill a firm belief?
Well, I don't know. In the first place, 2 or 3 days a week isn't going to get anybody anywhere with fluency in the liturgy. Of course, there's a lot more in the program today than it was then. A great emphasis on the holidays and customs, ceremonies, history. We didn't have much of that. We concentrated almost 100% on the liturgy. Reading, practice the liturgy, on and on and on.
But were you also taught how to read from the Torah?
No.
And you weren't.
No, we were taught how to read the Haftorah.
But you weren't given instruction in the melodies and the nigun, how to read the Torah portions?
No, just the Haftorah. And whatever rabbi was here at the time would do the bar mitzvah instruction. There was no such thing as hiring a tutor. A candidate was expected to learn how to read his Haftorah as part of the school program.
Tell us about how many young people were bar mitzvahed or became bar mitzvah over the years. When did it get to be so many?
Know, our one-room cheder would run 20 to 30 students. There wouldn't be more than a handful of bar mitzvahs a year, maybe 4 or 5, if that many.
Tell me about conversions to Judaism.
Never heard of one.
When you were growing up?
Yeah.
None.
No.
How about Jews leaving Judaism, becoming Christians?
There was one situation of an intermarriage, and I can remember my folks wouldn't even speak of it, or if they did speak of it, they would speak in whispers because it was such a horrible thing.
What year was this about? About
1920s or so.
1920s. What do you know about it? Anything?
What do you want to know? I mean, what do I know about it?
This was somebody you knew, a Jewish guy in town who married
Yes.
a Christian woman,
Yes.
and he remained in town.
Yes.
Was he avoided by the community?
Well, he ignored the community, and the community ignored him.
Do you remember his name?
Yes. Baver.
His last name was Baver.
Yes. He has descendants living in the community now.
Under the name Baver.
Yes.
Did they become Christian? What happened to them?
I think they're Christians. You know, what's her name? Grant? Oh, what's her first name? She was a Baver girl. Her married name is Grant. Lives here in town. Not members of the synagogue. Her husband, she is Jewish, her husband is Jewish. She's in that family. It was I think it's the oldest brother in the family. It was a big family. He married a Christian woman. The community was horrified.
And one daughter became Jewish?
This
Grant, you mean? This Grant woman?
Grant, oh yeah, they're Jewish. They have no children.
She became Jewish, the daughter.
No. This is a sister to the brother who married out.
Oh.
No, she's Jewish, her husband's Jewish, but they don't belong to our synagogue. They may belong to a synagogue in the Springfield area. I'm not sure about that.
So the message to the children at that time was, what's happened here is terrible.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, it was.
Were there many Jewish kids in your high school that you could go out with? How did you?
They're
how did you
about
meet
half.
your-
They're about half a dozen.
Half a dozen in the whole. How many kids in the high school? About.
600 or so, I guess.
Did you bond together?
We had
or
sort of an informal youth group where we would socialize,
at the synagogue or at the high school?
and in each other's homes.
Knowing consciously we're Jews and we're.
Oh yes, yes indeed.
Was there some anti-Semitism in the high school from the teachers?
I'm not conscious of it from the teachers. No.
You went on to Amherst College, is that
Yeah.
right? Why did you choose Amherst as compared to any other school?
Because I could live at home.
And how was that experience for you?
It was nothing. You know, I was going to college, going to classes, and studying, and
What year is that about when you went to Amherst?
I graduated in 1935.
And then did you go into law at that point?
Then I went to law school.
And then what happened?
Then nothing happened. I took a stab at practicing law for a year, and then I went in the Army.
Oh, what was your Army experience like?
Like what?
This is 1930 what?
1941.
Did you serve in this country? Did you go overseas?
No, I was in this country. I was in almost 4 years. And I came out and I was kind of half-heartedly looked for a job with a law firm. Meantime, my brother-in-law, Dave Lipshires, had moved along in the retail shoe business, and he wanted some assistance. Finally, they prevailed upon me to go to work for him. One of the inducements was that he had a vacant apartment and a couple of appliances, and they were as scarce as hen's teeth. So I took the job and I stayed there for 30 years.
What year were you married?
I was married in 1941.
How did you meet your future wife?
An interesting situation. George August, as Bob's father, was going with a girl from Greenfield. The girl from Greenfield's relatives had a summer place up at Windsor Lake, and also they had relatives in Springfield. The Springfield relatives were very, very close friends with Bernice's family, and they always did things together. So they cooked up a scheme. That family, the friends, the relatives of George's girlfriend, had a single daughter, and Bernice's family had Bernice, a single daughter. So they cooked up a deal that George would take me along on a Sunday up to Windsor Lakes, where they'd all be together, and I'd get introduced to this girl, Esther, the daughter of the friend's family. But Bernice was also there. So that worked out that I ended up with Bernice and not Esther.
What became of Esther?
Esther married a very nice man who has since died, lives in Springfield.
I'd like to ask you about how you were able to give your children a good, strong foundation in being Jewish, and were they able to pass this down to your grandchildren? How was that able to tell us?
That's a very touchy question.
Oh.
Because I was a failure at it. I wasn't able to instill much of anything in them. The younger one, who's married, they're affiliated with a Reconstructionist congregation, so they are identified as Jewish people, and they maintain a Jewish home. Their children are very cognizant of the fact that they're Jewish, but they're not very observant and not much in the way of synagogue goers.
Is this your... Tell us who
That's
they
my
are.
younger daughter,
Tell us.
her husband, and 3 children.
Uh-huh. Let's show it for the... Can you catch that, Jane? And who is... What are their names?
The daughter's name is Louise, her husband's name is Giuseppe, and the children in order of their age are Jessa, Hannah, and Alexander.
Who is Giuseppe? Tell me about him.
Yes, indeed. Very interesting. They met in Israel. You know, there was the route the kids took in those days to go to Israel, because there they could work out of kibbutz and get the board and room, and they had to travel around to Eilat, to Nepal. So when Louise graduated college, she and a couple of buddies took off on a trip to Europe. The two other girls were non-Jewish, came close to Christmas, they wanted to go home. So they parted company in Greece, and Louise went on to Israel by herself and went to a kibbutz. And Giuseppe was at that kibbutz at the same time.
Where's Giuseppe from?
Giuseppe was born in Italy. At the age of 1, the family moved to France because the father found work in France. So he grew up in France. He's fluent in French, Italian, English, some Spanish. He wasn't Jewish. So there was a period of instruction involved, and circumcision and conversion before the marriage.
She met him in Israel?
She met him in Israel. They were both volunteers on a kibbutz.
What kind of conversion did he go through?
He went through a conservative conversion with Rabbi Langenauer.
So apparently she brought him back to Northampton, her future husband.
Yes.
How did she, what was the process that happened for you in terms of this young man? Did he say to you, I'm going to marry your daughter, I will become Jewish? Did he say, I want to be Jewish and I will marry your daughter?
No. We visited her in Israel, and she told us about Giuseppe. And I said, well, I hope conversion is in the works. And she said, oh, yes, it is. So Rabbi Langenauer sent them to a friend of his who was serving as a rabbi in Israel, and they started instruction with him. And then they came back, to this country, and they were here about a week, and something or other happened, and they decided this was not in the cards for them, and he went back to France. And a day later, she followed. Apparently a change of heart. And then they spent some more time in Israel. They traveled. They went to Nepal, India, Afghanistan, the route. And then they came home again. And Rabbi Langenauer got Giuseppe an inconsequential job at the Northampton State Hospital.
Uh-huh.
And Louise got herself a job. They were married. They set up housekeeping in a little dinky apartment until the Six-Day War broke out. And they went back to Israel. And they were there another 6 months. And then we met them in France, and we toured for a week, and we came home, and then they came back here.
Did you think there was a possibility they would have stayed in Israel? That they would have stayed there?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Louise was very unhappy. It was during the first intifada, and she was very unhappy about the situation there. They came back here. She went to work, and she was working. Then he bethought himself, I wonder if I can handle American education. So he took the high school equivalency exam, applied to Hoyle Community College, was admitted, graduated valedictorian. Then he decided he wanted to get an MBA and applied to various schools, was accepted at Wharton, where he went and graduated.
So he's done okay for himself. At what point did he get actually converted? And was this to your own halakha, so to speak? Because today there's a controversy in the
Yeah, I know there is. Well,
how does it sit with you?
Rabbi Langenauer, who was a conservative rabbi.
This is in the early 60s when he was the rabbi here, right? We're talking when this was all going on? 65? Oh, the war is 67.
Yeah.
So they came back and got married like 68, the conversion? Just to give us a sense
No,
of
they were
time.
married before that war.
Okay, so 65, 66.
Yeah, somewhere in that area.
So how did it sit with you, this conversion?
It was perfectly acceptable to us for whatever Rabbi Langenauer dictated for the terms of conversion.
Was that because you respected this man? It was based on that, or is it because you adhere to the conservative tradition?
I don't follow you.
There is a controversy today, for instance, that the Orthodox do not recognize conservative conversion.
Right. He said the chances are that the conversion might not be recognized in Israel, but he didn't seem to be worried at all about that. He seemed to think that wouldn't happen.
So would you say the two of them from there evolved their own Jewish practice? This is the couple that's Reconstructionist that you're talking about?
Yeah, they're members of a Reconstructionist congregation.
Yeah. Okay. Thoughts about conversion today?
About what?
conversions today.
Yeah.
There's a lot of conversions going on. You want to speak to how you feel about the procedures that are used
Well,
today?
I don't know enough about it to speak. I really don't. I don't know what Rabbi Graubart requires or what they go through. I just don't know.
Do you have any advice, having, talked about your children and your experiences in terms of bringing up kids today, in terms of being Jewish? Your thoughts looking back now.
I really can't speak to it. I just don't know. I really don't know. The people think our religious school is excellent and all. I don't know. I don't see, because I go back to my own childhood and I think a product of a religious school should be able to come to services and participate in the service. I don't know how much these kids know about participation in the service. They know a few little verses here and there, but they really can't follow a service, in my opinion.
So something has happened in the home also, because you stressed before how important your home was to you.
Yeah. Well, how many homes today are kosher? How many homes today stress ritual observances? How many homes do they light the candles? Say grace before and after meals? I don't know. Just
What do you think has happened that there's much less of this today, lack of
well,
observance?
it's a process of assimilation.
Why didn't this happen in your time, 60 years ago, let's say? Why is it? You could have assimilated then, or was there such horror?
We didn't look for assimilation. We didn't care if we were accepted by the greater community or not. As long as they left us alone, let us earn a living.
I'd like to go to something else now. Who were some of your heroes or mentors? Were there people in your life who inspired you, who showed you a direction, who made you feel, this is the way I want to be or go? Who would you think of?
Well, for a time, there was a rabbi here named Ziff, and he taught me a great deal about the liturgy and leading the liturgy. So I owe him a lot of my training and knowledge. And I just seem to have a natural bent towards synagogue involvement. Now that seems to have rubbed off on my wife. And I don't know what else I can tell you.
What were some of the
about
things that you were involved with at the synagogue? Give us a few. What were some of your fondest recollections of some of your activities?
Well, I was president. I don't know how many terms, 3 or 4. I can't remember. I was president, though, during the fundraising, during the demolition of the old synagogue, the fundraising campaign, and the building of the new building. I was very much involved in that process. During periods when there was no rabbi, I'd try to keep things going by running some kind of a service on the holidays. Not terribly successful. People would come. We'd schedule a holiday service for 7 a.m. and be out by 9. And people would come, but someone would just sit there and read the morning newspaper. So it was a difficult period of time. Rabbi Lang and I really revitalized the community.
Why did he leave?
Why did he leave? He got an offer of a much, much, much better job as far as remuneration went in West Palm Beach, Florida. It didn't work out. As rabbi, he had the feeling that he was in charge. He's a very, very strong-willed person. There was also a multimillionaire member of the congregation who thought he was in charge.
His name was?
Rappaport.
What happened there?
Developer of the Century Village programs in Florida. as you may see in the frontispiece of the Sim Shalom Siddur, there's a sort of a declaration.
Irving Rappaport.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, they got into conflict, and then Langenauer had a heart attack. So he had to get out of the rabbit. And you think he went from a stressful job to a non-stressful job. He became a stockbroker and exceedingly successful at it.
He had an in with the powers that be. He had a good connection.
I don't know, but he applied in a couple of places, and Merrill Lynch took him on, and he's done very, very well with them.
What were some of the famous conflicts you had?
When you were president of the shul, what were some of the conflicts?
Well, the conflicts mostly were in fundraising, that getting people to donate what we thought they were capable of doing. You know what fundraising is like. We struggled and struggled and struggled. We managed to push it through. We got this building built.
Were there conflicts around the design of the building, how the ark should look, how the building should look?
No, not really.
How did you decide what it should look like inside?
I guess we interviewed some architects, and we hired a man named Gitberg in Springfield, and his design was acceptable to the building committee, and that's how it went.
How was the selection of the sculpture on the outside of the building made?
That was an interesting thing, too. There was a family in town donated the sculpture. When they saw what it looked like, they withdrew their donation.
Where they saw what the synagogue looked like, or the donation?
Donation to
Take it
pay
back,
for
take it back.
pay for the sculpture.
When they did not like the sculpture, in other words.
Right, right.
Who was that family?
Elliot Offner designed it.
And who donated it? Who donated?
Well, I'd rather not say.
Tell us about your connection to Leonard Baskin. I notice in your house you've got some Baskins hanging here.
Well, he also has
Mildred Wolf's late husband, Sam Wolf, used to do a lot of work with Baskin. He'd go to his workshop in the evenings and work with him, help him out, and Baskin would give him a lot of his prints and so forth. I mean, he took me along one night too, and I met Baskin, and somehow we weren't friends, but we were very pleasant to each other. When we would meet on the street, we would talk, and so I took a liking to him.
How is it that you have an Elia Shore print?
Beg pardon?
You have a print down at the end of the living room by Elia Shore.
That was in a book that Rabbi Langenauer had, and he made copies of it and gave it to his friends.
Are there any paintings in this room that are particularly fond of?
In the synagogue?
No, in your house.
This room?
Yeah.
I like that one. That's not. There was another self-portrait that I liked better, but when I left the community and moved to Rochester, the community wanted to give me a gift, and they heard I was interested in a self-portrait by Baskin, and they presented that to me.
When did you go to Rochester? I didn't hear about
1968.
that. And what connection was that?
I took a job with the Lawyers Cooperative Publishing Company. I hated the job. It's a wonderful community. I love the community. And Bernice had a nice job there with the YMHA library. We lived just a stone's throw from a beautiful conservative synagogue, but I hated the job, and I came back here to stay with my brother-in-law.
Where did you used to live in Northampton, and when did you buy this house? What were the various homes you had here?
I was born in our house. That was on what's now called Conn Street. But then about a year later, my father bought a house on Fruit Street, And I grew up there until the time I was married. Once married, lived in an apartment, I think next door to Mel Prowser. But as I say, I went into the service after about a year. And when I came back, my brother-in-law had an apartment for me on Reville Avenue off South Street. Lived there until 1948, when we bought the house that Mickey Glazier lives in now. And we moved there till 1968, when we moved to Rochester.
Where is the house that Mickey lives in?
That's on James Avenue. It's just down this direction, just the end of the street, and 1 block over. When we went to Rochester, we sold that house. We came back and found an apartment for 6 months, and this house became available. And I'd known about this house from long before I went away. So I grabbed the opportunity to buy it, and we've moved in here since then, 1969.
When you were growing up, was there a Jewish section of town where most of the Jews congregated or lived?
There was, to some extent, yes. That's William Street. You know where William Street is? You know where Hawley Street is? Well, Hawley Street is towards the end of Hawley Street. At that point, William Street runs parallel with it, 1 block over to the east.
Who were some of the families what names can you remember
Well,
who lived around there?
There was the Bennett August family lived there. My uncle Zelig Michelman lived there. I think there were a few others as well. And then there were others scattered around Market Street. See, they sought residences within walking distance of the synagogue, because they didn't ride to the synagogue.
At what point did it become acceptable to ride to synagogue? Was that when they finally built the synagogue a distance away? When did that happen?
Well, when people started to live distances away, they just started to ride.
Tell us about Zelig. What did he do, your uncle?
Who?
Zelig Michelman?
He was a junk dealer.
What became of him and his family?
Well, he's buried in our cemetery. His family is scattered. He was a brother to my mother. And my mother had a sister here, as well as 2 brothers, one of whom moved away to Fitchburg. Another brother in Springfield. And my mother's father, maybe mother too, I'm not sure of that, are buried in Springfield.
Tell us a bit about your mother. What she liked to do. Was she involved in the Jewish community a lot?
Oh yeah, in those days.
Tell us about her.
In those days, the sisterhood was known as the Ladies' Aid Society, and they would meet every 2 weeks, what they call a coffee party, in different homes, and people would bring in baked goods that they'd auction off to raise money. Eventually, that function was moved to the synagogue, and they'd have these coffee parties as fundraisers in the synagogue. And she was literate. She could read Hebrew, participate in the prayers. Very devoted to her house and family. Strictly kosher home. Instructed the children.
What was her full name?
Pardon?
What was her full name?
Bessie Michelman Alberts.
How about in Hebrew?
Bryna.
How about your father?
Bryna Bas Yosef David.
How about your father?
Elihu ben, oh dear, how could I have forgotten that? Yeshua's Ben Yeshua Zealot.
How would you describe their relationship, your mother and father? Would you say your father was in charge of the house? Would you say your mother was in charge? What was that like?
Mother was in charge of the house. I think they were very devoted to each other in their way. Very devoted.
You say in their way. Tell us about how men and women showed devotion in their way in that day.
Well, I don't think there was much demonstrative affection. The women worked hard, very hard, in their homes. And the men struggled to bring in a living. And what more did they want? They didn't want anything more. It's a lot of work keeping a kosher home. No washing machine, no dishwasher, no garbage disposer. It was work.
Do you have siblings? I don't know if you... Siblings.
I had one brother and three sisters.
What became of them and their families?
The brother married a girl from New York and lived here, had two daughters. One is deceased and one lives out in Colorado somewhere. My oldest sister, Minnie Lipshires, had two children, a daughter who's married, lives in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and a son who taught in the community college system in Connecticut, now retired, lives in West Hartford. My next sister, Esther, had two daughters, Louise, who lives in Florida, and Barbara, who's married, lives in West Hartford. My sister Sylvia had no children.
All your nieces or nephews, how did they look to you? In other words, were you like the person who was the Jewish person in the family? Did you represent that to them in some way?
You know, I don't know. I think they look upon me as an old relative. I don't think I impinge too much on their thoughts, but they're very, very respectful, very pleasant to me.
What have we not asked you? What have we not asked you about that you'd like to talk about?
Well, you might ask me what I would do at the synagogue if I had my own way.
What would you do at the synagogue if you had your own way?
I would make the service more traditional. I'm not bothered by the fact women have aliyahs or women lead service. But I don't like all the omissions that take place.
How do you think this can happen, that it will become more traditional again?
Depends on what kind of rabbi we have. I think the community will pretty much follow the lead of the rabbi. I don't think they would follow him to the point of a return to orthodoxy, but I think they would follow him to return to somewhat more traditional.
So the committee now that's going to select a new rabbi, this is a very significant question.
It is indeed. And I have no idea what their thinking is. The makeup of it is pretty diverse.
Tell us about, I'm always intrigued, about Jim Raymond and this separate cemetery they had. What was that all about? I wanted to ask Jim, but he's gone now. What was that, this whole German-Jewish group that had a separate and tell me about his family somewhat, how they came here.
I don't know what brought them here. I just don't know. I don't think they had any relatives in the area. I think Jimmy's father grew up in an orphanage. But eventually he got to Northampton. He had this business, Twin Cleaners, which he made very, very successful. Very generous contributor to the synagogue, to Jewish charities, but very little interest in the synagogue. I don't know if he ever came.
This is the father, Jimmy's
This
father.
is the father, yeah.
His name was?
Adolf.
Adolf, right.
Jim had a terrible tragedy in his life. He had twin daughters, and I think at about somewhere around the age of 5, one got hit by an automobile and killed. Then I don't know what happened. I've heard, and I don't know if it's true or not, I've heard they wanted to buy a family plot in the cemetery, and the cemetery committee wouldn't sell them a family plot. I can't fault them for that. I know there's a Michelman family plot in the middle of the cemetery with 8 graves, three are used and the rest are just vacant in the middle of the cemetery. But in any case, the Raymonds took offense at that and arranged to have the child buried in the German cemetery.
What's the origin of this German cemetery?
That was the first cemetery in Northampton. It was set up by the German Jews I had reference to, who were the first immigrants to Northampton. They owned 6 acres of land up on North King Street. The southernmost portion is their cemetery, then there's a vacant area, then there's our cemetery that they sold to us, and then some more vacant land. All the way up to a brook that separates their land from the state police barracks land. Once the child was interred in that cemetery, Adolf got very involved with it, and he used to maintain it himself. He would go there and cut the grass. And this kind of devolved on Jimmy. The descendants of the original people who set up that cemetery were dispersed, few in number, and they didn't care, particularly as long as Adolf or Jimmy was willing to take care of the place. They wouldn't interfere. They didn't care. Let him do what he wanted. So that's how he happened to become in charge of the whole process.
What's happened to it now that Jimmy's gone? Do you know?
There's still some people in Greenfield who are involved with it. I don't know who's responsible for it now. Part of the deal that was cooked up between them and our cemetery was that we would pay for the maintenance of that cemetery up to $2,000 a year. I was never happy about that.
So who gets to be buried there?
Anyone who wants to, I guess. The most recent burials there were Simon Cohn and Marcus Cohn. No, Marcus? No, the children of Marcus. Simon and... Oh, I can't think of his name, isn't that awful? Anyway, these 2 sons, the only children of Marcus Cohn, who was one of the original Jewish settlers in Northampton, founder of that cemetery, are both buried there.
So it functions as one unit now? Or you have to
No,
apply to a
no,
different
that's-
organization?
Still 2 very separate organizations.
Speaking about Greenfield, did you know some Jews in Greenfield? Can you tell us something about the connection between the Jewish synagogue in Greenfield and the Northampton? How come they set up a synagogue there? Do you know much about that?
Know very little about it. They set it up because apparently the Jewish population in Greenfield was sufficient to support it.
Did you have much contact with Jews in Greenfield growing up?
Growing up, no.
How about Amherst?
When I was growing up, there were about 5 or 6 Jewish families in Amherst.
Did you have contact? Who were they? Do you remember them?
Well, the Landis family, they were known as Labrovich in those days. He used to come to synagogue in Northampton every once in a while, so I got to know him, and I got to know some of his sons. There was a family named Ginsburg that I used to stay with over Shabbat when I was a student there.
Oh.
And there are one or two other families.
How were you able to practice being Jewish while you were at Amherst College? What was that like?
Well, I lived at home, and Friday night I'd stay with this Ginsburg family and eat with them.
And where would you go to shul on Shabbos then, if you were with them?
No, because I was in Amherst on Shabbos. We had classes then.
You had
On
classes
Saturdays.
on Saturday.
Oh, I see. He lived at home during the week and stayed with the Ginsburgs. Was Ginsburg affiliated with the university, or were they also shopkeepers?
Amherst?
Ginsburg.
The Ginsburgs at Amherst.
Oh,
What did they do
Ginsburg.
for-
He
what did
was
they do
he had a cobbler shop. No, in those days, none of those families were connected with the university. I think the first person really of any note on the faculty was this an English professor whose name escapes me at the moment.
What year was that?
Perhaps in the early 1930s.
Was there a political statement you could make about the Jews of Northampton? Were they Democrats? Were they Republicans? And were they different in terms of politics to the Jews of Greenfield?
The most prominent of the Jewish families in politics was Samuel Michelman, who was a Democrat. He was responsible for getting Smith College to give automatic scholarships to Northampton residents. I think he was a councilman. Some years after that, Samuel B. August was a councilman. That's about the extent I know about involvement with local politics.
Were most of the people in the shul, were there political debates, discussions? Were they Adlai Stevenson types? I mean, was there some active argument? Were there some communists around back in the 30s? Was there a labor movement? Was there anything going on?
Not within the synagogue itself, no. There were some Jewish people involved in the socialist movement.
Oh, the guy in East Hampton. What was his name?
Leopold?
Yeah, Leopold, right?
Well, before him. Before him.
Were they organizing in the Northampton community?
No. No, I don't think so.
So politics wasn't a big thing.
A big pardon?
Politics was not a big thing for the Jews.
No.
This reminds me, was there a sense in the community about being Jewish and like being very cautious, like it's a shanda? You got to be careful, like in the 1920s and 30s.
I think so.
Can you think of examples of where, outside of this one intermarriage, where people would say, come on, be quiet, we don't want them to know about that?
No, I thought that was kind of in the back of your mind all the time.
What was the expression used? What were the expressions that were used to convey that?
Oh, Ken just said a shanda for the goyim. But, it's the same thing as it is today. If you see a person with a Jewish name accused of a crime, you feel very uncomfortable about it. So it was the same thing then.